In this chapter, he talked a little bit about mining and the various different things he was doing. Now, it may seem surprising about the people just digging a hole in the ground and pulling out the minerals. That's actually for a long, long time how mining was done. And there are a lot of places where it's still done today. Um, in Africa, there is a mineral which is called cobalt. And cobalt is used for all sorts of things with high tech. It's used in batteries, it's used for various different types of steel because it gives good heat resistance. It's used all over the place. There's even colors named after it, cobalt red and cobalt blue, which are brilliant colors. Anyway, there are proper mines in Africa for this. And then there's a whole bunch of people who go out and mine it by hand, where they go out and they have a shovel or a stick and they dig in the ground and they dig for rocks that have this mineral in it that they then take and sell. And a lot of this really primitive mining is done, well, it's done by poor people because they don't have the equipment to do real mining. But there's so many of them and it's relatively abundant there that they actually get away with this. Now, the problem with this is that you have a lot of people who are essentially thieves and they do a protection racket. And so they steal the cobalt from these people or force them to work. And essentially, these people are slaves. But that is the way that mining used to be done. Nowadays, they dig tunnels, square tunnels into rock or dig down. And with the square tunnels, then they shore it up and then they put rail lines in. So what happens is as you work forward, you have a cart. The cart runs along the tracks, the rail lines essentially. And because the cart runs along, as you dig at the front of the wall, you load the stuff onto the cart and the cart slides back. And you can dig and start loading the cart. And so you'd have this sort of progression of the thing where, all of the stuff gets loaded into the cart and the cart gets trucked out. And because the cart gets trucked out, you have one person moving several times their weight in ore out of the mine, which means that instead of one person digging and then carrying out 20 pounds, you have 10 people digging and they dig out 200 pounds, 2,000 pounds, and then load that into the cart and the guy pushing the cart. So you have double the work done, triple the work done, 10 times the work done because you don't have to have everyone going down into the mine, coming back out with the stuff. You just have one person pushing the cart out. Now, we talked about getting telegraph lines set up. Now, a telegraph is a relatively simple invention. You have a battery, or you have an electric source. You have two wires, one with electricity going out, one with electricity going back. You have a switch at one end and a relay at the other. And the relay is essentially just an electromagnet. So that when the electricity goes out through, goes around the iron core of the electromagnet, it creates a magnetic field and it pulls a tap down. And it pulls the tap down, then it clacks. So I tap the switch over here, it closes the circuit, and that taps on the other side and says, closes that. So what happens is that I click over here and this clicks over there. Now, the problem with this is that you need lots of copper for the wire. You need to make the electromagnets. And as I said, making the electromagnets aren't hard. That's a fun little experiment, and Pops can show you how to do it one day. I have all the stuff laying around to do it in the house, and we can make electromagnets someday. That's going to be fun. But anyway, making electromagnets aren't hard, but the problem is that you need iron and you need copper for the wire. You can make it out of other things, but these are the things that are used because they're relatively cheap. So you have telegraph wires, and he's making miles and miles of this, which means he's digging up tons and tons of copper, but his improvements aren't quite there enough. And he also has to have a means to refine the copper, which is foundries. Because, as I said before, when it was people just pulling rocks out of the ground and loading them into a bag, which works, but, it's not what you build a civilization on top of. They would then take it to what was essentially a wood-fired oven, maybe charcoal-fired oven. And so they would put it in the oven and they would get it hot. And that would be enough to get different metals out. So you can get copper out like that. You can get zinc out like that. If you have a coal-powered furnace, or you get really clever with the design, you can get steel out like that. But you won't get cobalt. And you won't get some other things. So you can get to the Bronze Age, you can get to the early Iron Age with that basic thing. But to get anything bigger, you need massive furnaces. And you need these massive blast furnaces. So he needs to build those up. And he needs a lot of labor because the massive blast furnaces are essentially huge are designed piles of rock. So there's a whole bunch of them around here. I'll take you and show you a furnace someday. But anyway, the furnaces, they're kind of trapezoidal frustrums. Frustrum, great word. It means a pyramid with the top cut off. So they're these kind of frustrums with a hole in the bottom, and you load iron and coal and iron and coal and iron and coal into the top. And you light the fire, and the fire burns up through. And then it gets this good draft up. But, and then everything burns, and you open the side, and it melts out. But so he has to build these things, and that's not easy, and that takes a lot of work to build these things. But, as I said, he frees up a little bit of labor there, and he says he improves the taxes. Now, for the longest time, tax collecting was kind of like actually, even now it's somewhat like this, where you have someone who's designated by the government to collect the taxes. So I go and I pay my taxes. I just paid my taxes to the government, and it was like huge amounts of money. When I looked at it, it's like, oh, this is all the money I gave the government this year. And so, this is all the money the government took from me. And there were tax collectors, and the king would have the tax collectors and send the tax collectors out, and the tax collectors would say, you owe the king 200 pieces of gold. And the person would go and say, okay, here's my 200 pieces of gold. And the tax collector would go back to the king and said, here's the 100 pieces of gold you asked for, and then keep some for himself. It probably wasn't quite that egregious, but that was the sort of thing that happened. And the funny thing is that in Pennsylvania, local tax collectors, like the people who collect for the tax for this town, they actually get a piece of the money. So the tax collector who essentially fills out paperwork and sends letters saying you owe money gets a cut of the tax that they collect. So, and this was even in the biblical time, even back in the Bible, and it's actually called out in the Bible where, their tax collectors were hated because, they take money from the people and give it to the government, and the Roman government was not popular anywhere. The Roman government was just not popular. And in the Holy Land, so in Judea, collecting the money, sending it off to Rome. And so what happened was tax collectors, as I said, they would collect more and keep it for themselves. And so tax collectors went up to Jesus and said, I don't, I want to be a good person. What do I have to do to be a good person? And Jesus was like, don't collect more than you're supposed to collect. And just be happy with the salary. So, they would be paid by Rome. But at the same time, they could collect some graft and some kickbacks. Or collect more and then pocket it. And this, having a system like that where the tax collectors can profit. Oh, when it was totally allowed that, the people had to pay whatever the tax collector said they had to pay. And all Rome cared about was getting the amount that they said they wanted. So if the tax collector collected more, Rome didn't care. So, and the problem with the system like that is it's open to corruption. And so, and there are a number of places in the world where you have government agents and people who work for the government who go and take money off of just random people. It's like, oh, you want a driver's license? Yeah, I don't know. I can't quite find the paperwork. Oh, you have a $20 bill? Yes, here's your driver's license. And so there's a lot of places where there's these sort of shakedowns. And there are places where you have these whole cadre of middlemen whose entire job is to know the right people to bribe and to get the bribes done. So if you're in one of these places and you are someone who's connected, you say, I need a new driver's license. And the fixer will say, okay, that's $10 for the driver's license, $10 for a bribe, and $5 for me. And the person goes, okay, and they pay their $45, and then they get their driver's license in like a day or two. Otherwise, they may spend more than the $20 for the bribe. They spend the $40 for a bribe and $20 for the license. So it piles up. And the problem is that when you have a system like this that's enforced like this, it just slows everything down. And it pulls a lot of energy out of the system. Because here you have all of these people whose job is facilitating and organizing and helping. And I'm using scare quotes here, so these words don't really mean what they sound like they mean. So you have all of these people whose purpose is to make things happen that should just happen anyway. I should just go down to the DMV with the $10 I need to renew my license and they hand me a new one. I shouldn't have to pay them off, and I shouldn't have to, I shouldn't face the threat of being pulled over for whatever, and it's like, oh yes, officer, here's a donation to the policeman's benevolent fund. Okay, go. Things like that. Once you have people whose job it is to be corrupt, then that takes people away from doing useful things like flushing toilets and cleaning sewers and mowing lawns, and I don't know, all sorts of useful things can be done with all of the energy that gets put into graft. And that's one of the big advantages that he did. He cut down on a lot of that. And he said he quadrupled the revenue, but came out ahead, and the people felt a less burden, which really means that there was a lot of this sort of thing going on, and he probably made a lot of enemies that way. And who knows what will happen there, but he probably made a lot of enemies that way.